moving China, maybe like Dao, the Chinese leader who modernized, was it Dao, what's his name?
Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping, yes, exactly. He doesn't seem like another Deng Xiaoping. He seems to me more like another Mao. And that's very worrisome on the Taiwan front. So what do you think's on the horizon on the China front, and what do you think the West should do about it?
Right. No, it's really interesting because from the Chinese point of view, first of all, we have to understand that the people like I and you would talk to from China aren't representative of the mass of the Chinese in China. The average Chinese person has never left China, didn't study for years in the English-speaking world at an American or Canadian university or what have you, and for them, it looks very frustrating. They see China as this great nation with a growing economy, largest population in the world, at least until India catches up. And then they look and they see, look at Iran, a tiny country, backwards in many ways compared to China, which has been running the table in the Middle East. It's in Syria, it's in Lebanon, it's in Yemen, it's causing problems everywhere you look. Even Russia has gotten Crimea and has achieved things. Where has the Chinese government gotten? What has it done? The answer is it's done less than Iran, done less than than Russia in terms of expanding. So I think there's pressure on the Chinese government from a lot of Chinese public opinion. Why aren't you more effective? If we're as great as you're telling us, why don't the foreigners see that and give ground to us? So there's a clash between what a lot of Chinese people think China's place in the world should be and what they actually see. And the government, as you say, at this time of huge stress, the COVID policy, they locked them down for years, and now they're still having a massive epidemic. The housing market, which is where most Chinese have their savings and investment, house prices have been going down for almost 3 years. There's a major crisis building financially in China. And so the government is in a real pickle as to what does it do next. And that makes it a little bit unpredictable internationally.
Well, I was just curious as to your evaluation of the Biden administration's response to the situation in Taiwan. What opinions do you have about the Biden formulation of foreign policy in relationship to China?
Look, I think the Biden administration has done a reasonably good job so far in terms of its messaging on Taiwan and on the U.S.-China relations, the CHIP Act, and it's putting economic pressure. It is trying to stop the penetration. So much of Chinese growth has really come from the theft of IP and from intellectual property, from Chinese state subsidies to corporations, in key sectors that are able to use those subsidies to compete unfairly in the rest of the world. And I think we are beginning to see, and this, it started in the Trump years, and even President Obama talked about a pivot to Asia. So there's been a growing awareness in the U.S. on a need to focus more on China and not just sort of sit here and wait for capitalism to turn China democratic, which is what we were maybe doing 20 years ago. So we're definitely ahead on that front.
So since I was a young person, what's happened in China? Well, first of all, when I started to become politically aware, let's say back in the 1970s, I remember going to a trade fair in Edmonton, Alberta. It was one of the first trade fairs that the Chinese participated in. That probably is about 1974, something like that. And we went and looked at, the Chinese had a display there of their industrial products, and it looked like stuff that had been manufactured in the West right after the Second World War. Like it looked like stuff that was built in the 1950s. But that was the first time in my lifetime that we saw anything at all of China. And then, of course, when I was very young, the threat of famine was still something that we associated with China. And what I've seen happen in my lifetime is that China has become an economic powerhouse, that the threat of famine has receded substantially, that the Chinese had been integrated, at least to some degree, into the world economy, that the West had benefited, arguably, from an influx of unbelievably inexpensive consumer goods as Chinese manufacturing quality improved, as it did in Japan. And for a good while, it looked like the Chinese were going to settle in beside us in lockstep, even though as competitors and cooperators, and move us all towards a relatively integrated capitalist future. And of course, the presumption was that as that happened, that the state would liberalize, not least because there would be all sorts of individuals in China who now had a certain degree of economic power, and that the Chinese would incrementally transform essentially into allies playing under the same system. And I think that really was happening in a pretty damn optimistic way for a number of decades, till Xi decided to centralize control and turn himself into another Mao. And it isn't obvious that the optimism that the West had in relationship to China was exactly misplaced. I mean, I think the Western working class paid a big price for integrating China. But other than that, the Chinese aren't starving anymore, which is certainly a big plus. And there were a lot of positives to attempting to integrate the Chinese into the world economy. The downside was we seemed to become more dependent on their largesse and goodwill than we needed to. And then, of course, China as a totalitarian model is a destabilizing force in the international order.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I would agree with you completely that, well, look, until a few years ago, I would travel pretty freely in China. And a couple of my books have been translated into Chinese, and I would speak at Chinese universities and talk with professors and officials. And the view that you just expressed was very common. This is what they felt China was doing and should do, was move toward this kind of integration to become what some Chinese used to tell me, a normal country is what they wanted China to become. And I think there are a lot of people there who still hope that. Obviously, they're not going to say so right now. That would not be good for you or your family if you started talking that way. But I think what happened in some ways is we tended to forget that the Chinese Communist Party is a real thing, and it wants to hold power. And there are lots of people who see, they look at Chinese history. Yes, the Communist Party has killed more Chinese than anything ever in the history of the world, have died as a result of Mao's famines and other things, far eclipsing the death toll, say, in their war against Japan even. But that said, as you pointed out, the economic growth of